Welcome back to Chapter 1. This is the podcast where we talk about media, primarily film, books, and music. And today we're talking about a book that has just blown my mind. Before we get into that, though, I do want to take a quick second to say something somewhat serious. I know that my podcast has a lot of lightheartedness around it, and we try to connect to a very deep human perspective, but I do know and am aware that the world feels very heavy right now. I think that this podcast has the intention of relieving some of that weight, and so that is why I don't really like to bring up politics and worldly matters, because so many other creatives do that so eloquently, and I believe that they should hold that place in the world. But I do want to note that the world feels very heavy. I am very aware of that, and I hope that coming to this podcast kind of relieves you of that weight in some way or another. With all of that said, this is a place where I do want my listeners to feel light and like you've been loved for a little bit of time. Now, today we're talking about a book that I picked up probably, oh my god, it was so long ago, over a year at this point, and it was recommended to me because I am such a nature freak. I love being outdoors. I love hiking. I love being enveloped in nature and just letting it hold me. And someone had heard this author on a podcast and told me that I should check out her book. Today we're talking about The Light Eaters by Zoë Schlanger. Zoe started out as a climate journalist, and from my perspective and from interviews that I've seen with her, she got quite burnt out in that, which is understandable. And so she moved away from environmental journalism to journalism on plants. Now, fortunately for all of us and for her, she has a network that is full of botanists all over the world. And so she was able to go to these botanists and utilize her journalism skills and knowledge to uncover a lot of really, really interesting things. Now, I believe, I don't want to say that all of this is fact. In fact, I do want to encourage you to take a look at this book, take a look at one of her interviews to get her exact perspective. This is just a reaction that I'm having to the concepts that she has written out in this book. And I want to state that for all of my episodes, I'm not a professional in any form other than I want to sit down and have fun and react to this media that has moved something within me. I have spent a lot of time reading philosophy and self-help books and things along that nature, and I've lived a lot of life. So this is purely a reaction through my lens. And I'm hoping that you connect with it in some way, but just as a disclosure. This is purely my perspective and just me rattling off about the way that this book and the media that I react to in this podcast have hit me. So The Light Eaters drew my interest because it's about plants, and specifically about plant consciousness. So the idea that plants are sentient and smart, the idea that they can think and potentially feel, and that concept. So through this book, Zoe speaks about traveling the world and meeting up with scientists, botanists, other journalists, professors who have been working on these concepts for years and years. There's a lot of research going into the idea that plants are conscious. And there has been for a long time. There was a book that was released, I believe, back in the 90s about plant consciousness called The Secret Life of Plants. Now, since then, and Zoë Schlanger is sure to note this in her book, that book made a lot of claims that are not true at all. But it did make a huge impact on the world and created these waves that rippled throughout society and started this, maybe not started this conversation, but added to the conversation of plant consciousness. And now I think Zoë Schlanger's The Light Eaters is doing something very similar. We may find out in a few years that anything that's in this book is also completely false. But for now, I think it is interesting to say that the research is happening. And there are things that I believe prove that plants are smart. Throughout this book, Zoe talks about a lot of different concepts, but she mentions that ferns are some of the oldest plants on the planet. And if you are my friend, you know that ferns draw a particular interest of mine. And so I found it fascinating to find out that they are Jurassic plants, which, oh God, it's so interesting to think about a plant being around the same time that dinosaurs are, and to think about how old dinosaurs are, and the fact that these plants have been living on this planet and haven't gone extinct. It's just fascinating to me. You know, I think that some plants, actually I know some plants are clones of each other. There's one specific tree that is a clone of itself, and I just find that so fascinating. So to me, that kind of makes me feel like the plants that are here today have a very, very small percentage of the plants that existed in the Jurassic Age, meaning that they hold the same, I guess, energy as the plants that existed in the Jurassic times. I mean, that's a far stretch, obviously, but I love that concept of something having even a small percentage of the, let's say, DNA from the Jurassic time, and it's sitting in my backyard. I think that that's so fascinating. And ferns are fascinating in themselves, just alone. They're so beautiful, and they actually spore like a mushroom instead of produce seeds like the majority of other plants. And I've seen this happen in the wild. I think it's really, really beautiful, but they put up like a cone of just spores, and then they just release them. And it's just, I don't know why that fascinates me so much, but I think because it creates such a unique plant, I think it draws my attention. So basically, I'm just going to be walking through some of my notes that I have on this book because there were so many fascinating points. And then I think I'm just going to let my mind kind of just unravel and allow space for how this connects to human consciousness and the experience that we're all living in today. So a major note before we get too deep into this concept is that we should not be comparing plant consciousness to human consciousness. We are two totally different things, and it's unfair to compare humans to plants or plants to humans because of that fact. It's like comparing wood to metal, you know, like it's just, it doesn't make sense. And to look at a plant and be like, well, it doesn't have a brain, so it's not smart, is unfair. And we don't know if that's true. Just because we haven't discovered a plant's brain doesn't mean that it's not there. It may look totally different. It may be invisible and completely immaterial. But I do want to note that the consciousness within plants, you can't compare it to human consciousness. We're just different things. Some of the notes that I really, really like throughout this book are that they have done studies on plants with stingers, so like stinging nettle, which if you haven't seen that out in the wild, it's like a spiky plant that if you rub a piece of your such a weird sentence, but if you like rub by the plant and your skin makes contact with it, it does sting a little bit. What's interesting about stinging nettle is that like people make tea out of it and you can cook with it, and it has such a nice smell. It reminds me of like almond extract almost. But apparently the stingers that are on plants are made up of a similar material as fangs from animals. So I don't know why that makes me so happy, but for some reason the idea of a plant like sinking its quote-unquote fangs into you as you walk by it makes me giggle. So next time you're outside and if you happen to run into a stinging nettle or some other plant that stings, keep that in mind. It is biting you. So Zoë Schlanger spent some time traveling the world. She went to Chile, she went to Hawaii, she went to Costa Rica, I believe Costa Rica, and just all over the world to visit different botanists. And one of the more interesting notes that I found within her travels is the idea that Hawaii was such a perfect environment for plants because there was minimal contact there, and the environment was so perfect that the plants there have been able to evolve very rapidly and freely. I love the idea of plants having this little spot of perfection where they can just grow rapidly and expand without limits. And so that environment has created a space for plants to evolve into these really unique beings on Hawaii. It just makes me really curious about the plants that are there and what they look like and how they've evolved. And in that same vein, we can talk about the evolution of flowers. Zoë Schlanger mentions that a lot of plants used to just have leaves, and in order to attract pollinators, some of them started to evolve their leaves and make them more visually pleasing. So eventually leaves became a little more colorful and distinct from the rest of the plant and the rest of the plants around them. And then all of a sudden we have flowers. And I love flowers. I think they're so sweet and beautiful, and every single one of them is so different. So the idea of plants recognizing that they need to attract pollinators better and attract them better than their neighbors, so they create flowers from nothing. Not nothing, but they create something from what they have, is so dreamy. And it really makes me think of mothers and how they grow placenta, which is something that is not within the human body before being pregnant. And I love that comparison, and I think that those two ideas hold hands really well together, because it's like, how are we evolving? How are we reproducing? How, like it's all in the same vein in my brain, and I love linking those two things too. I know that we should not compare plants to humans because we're totally different, but it's fun for me to sit down and think about the things that we have in common, even if it's something small, like leaves. I have leaves. So through her research, Zoë Schlanger reveals that there's a lot of research on plants having a memory and if they can see, and there's evidence to suggest that they do. There have been studies that show that plants have memory. So the idea of plants having memory is really tender to me. I think that a plant holding such complex concepts as memory is just really tender. And why shouldn't they? You know what I mean? They've been around forever. I just think it makes sense to me. Some plants do have to take into consideration the fact that winter happens, and plants have what these botanists and researchers call memory of winter. So they will sit in the ground and wait a certain amount of months until they come out. And it's just, when we think about plants, I think the majority of society believes that they're just there. They're not alive, they're not thinking, and they're there for decoration, or they're there outside within nature. And they're kind of just written off and not considered, I think, for the general public. So the idea that plants have memory and can remember when winter comes and goes is just, I don't know. Maybe y'all have had more expansive thoughts than I have in my life, but it just blows my mind, because I think for a very long time I have been like, plants are not, they're just there, they're dead, they're not sentient, so obviously I shouldn't take them into consideration. But it's just like the total opposite is true. I think that plants hold a lot of power, and I think that these studies reveal that. A lot of these studies are on the idea of plants, quote unquote, seeing. Now, they don't have eyeballs like we do, but plants can, quote unquote, see you if you're standing near them due to the change in the field of light. So technically, they don't have eyeballs, but they are aware of where you're standing due to the bending of the light that happens when you enter a room or you stand close to them. And I love that. It's just like, careful what you're doing around your plants. They can see it. Will they judge you? No, they don't care. They're plants. They're thriving. They're doing their thing. But I love that. Another note that Zoë Schlanger mentions in The Light Eaters is that ginkgo trees can be both male and female simultaneously. They're one of the only plants, supposedly, that can do that. And I think that is so cool. And they can change. Like, they can change from male to female, but they can be male and female. And I wanted to bring this up because they note that in science, a plant that is both female and male is called perfect. And I love that. I love that concept so much. So ginkgo trees are out here really doing it all. Going into more like survival, plant survival, Zoë Schlanger talks about tomato plants and how they can release oils that make caterpillars that attack them eat each other. So you're a tomato plant. Do this exercise with me. You're a tomato plant. You're happily sitting in your little garden bed, and along comes a caterpillar that would very much like to eat your tender leaves. That doesn't make you happy, obviously, because you're trying to survive and create tomatoes and thrive in the sunshine. So what you do is you release an oil that, as the caterpillars are eating it, they decide that they would now like to taste their friends. And that to me is so wild. I don't want to think about it for too long, but I'm just thinking about the evolution of plants and how we consume them. And I'll just let your imagination take over from there. But I just find it really, really interesting that that's a defense mechanism that a plant has. It's so smart. The idea, like, think about sitting down and creating something from your being, from nothing, essentially. Not really nothing, but from light and water and the nutrients in the ground that deters your enemies. That is crazy. That is such a wild, out of the box concept for me. I don't know why. But to be able to create something that protects you out of what you have, and to be able to pinpoint the thing that is eating you and being like, okay, how do I create an oil that will make this thing attack itself, essentially? That's wild. That is a wild concept. I don't know why. We'll talk about it later. In that same vein of creating something from nothing, plants literally, they survive off of very little. They make sugar out of air, out of sunlight, out of water. So yes, I mean, if you take away one of those things, the plants will have a hard time creating sugar and surviving. But as evolution has proven, plants will be able to evolve through that. And because plants can't just get up and move, and because they want to keep surviving and come up every year, they have to shift. They have to change in order to adhere to the changes in their environment. So yes, like if it doesn't rain, or if it's cloudy all the time, the plants will evolve. And you can see this if you change biomes. And you can see that if you travel, and if you have the opportunity to travel, you can recognize that the biome that you're traveling to is different from where you live. It just blows my mind. And I mean, we've seen this in humans too. Humans have evolved over the years to respect their environment. And it's interesting. The fact that something that we believe is just a plant, it's just there. It doesn't mean anything deeper, when in reality, nature feels like the answer to all of life sometimes. Zoë Schlanger talks about plants not having a brain and not comparing human consciousness to plant consciousness, because we are two totally different beings. But she does go into the idea of, yes, in fact, they don't have a brain, but what if their entire being is the brain? And because the research on this is so young, there's no one right now to really prove to me that that's not true. Maybe we'll find out one day within my lifetime, but I wouldn't doubt if plants do in fact have a brain. It's just, it doesn't look like ours. Plants do also react to touch. I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen videos online of plants actually closing up their leaves to people touching them. And I think that makes so much sense. And I think that plants do change if you touch them. Even if you're out in nature, there is something that shifts in their biology as a reaction to that. Maybe not their biology, but definitely in their energy. And just because we can't recognize it immediately doesn't mean it's not happening. There are studies that Zoe talks about in this book about plants actually changing color because of touch. So they're smart. They're just smart in a different way. And I do wonder what the purpose of the plant changing colors is. If it's an evolutionary thing, what is the intent of that? And if it's not, maybe it is just the plant reacting, which is also very interesting. Some plants can send out chemicals or help signals that will attract the enemies of the insects eating them. We kind of went over this with the tomato plants, but the tomato plants excrete an oil. Some plants can actually send out help signals throughout their roots and stuff that will attract the enemies of the insects eating them. I believe there's a wasp or something that Zoe speaks about in this book, and pardon my lack of being able to know exactly what she's speaking on in this concept. I read this book, I just finished it probably 3 weeks ago, but I've been reading it over the course of a year, so some of these concepts are just, they're in the back of the brain hole. But the idea of plants sending out these help signals, and for the plants around them to feel them, and for those help signals to kind of ripple throughout the environment and attract these enemies of the bugs that are eating them, it's just blows my brain open. It's crazy. In a totally different conversation, when you think about the rye plant, well, when I think about it, I think about bread, right? Rye bread is delicious. I love it. It's always been something that has been in my household throughout my childhood and everything. And I've always thought that it was just like a kind of a different wheat, or a different grain. And it actually originally was a weed. And the rye weed was found amongst wheat plants, and it evolved its design to look more like wheat. And that is something that certain plants can do, which we'll get into in a moment. But when it realized that it was being pulled up by farmers because it was a weed and affecting the wheat, rye survived by changing the way it looks. And so the farmers thought that it was wheat. And it's just so smart, like adapting to your environment to that degree, because you're recognizing that the environment that you're in is hostile and you need to survive. And so you change the way that you look throughout the years so that you look like the plants that are being left behind is, again, mind-blowing. What is happening in the world with plants? Back to the idea of plants evolving to look like other plants around them. There are plants in South America that can copy the plants around them to the extent of scientists not being able to pick up on the fact that they are replicas of the original easily. They pick up on them because they're smart scientists and they observe and stuff like that. But if a scientist were just walking through the woods, it would be very easy for them to register this plant as a different plant. And I think Zoe talks about how some holly bushes actually do this, which is crazy. I love a holly bush. They're so sweet. But it's mind-blowing. And I think this is why I wanted to speak about this book so much, is because every single chapter blew my mind. And I know some people have probably already heard these concepts, depending on the opportunities that you've had. But for me, this was like a totally life-changing book, because yes, I've in the past few years, I have had the thoughts that, trees are living beings, all plants are living beings, obviously, but what if they're just like so much smarter than we think? Trees have been around forever, ? They've been around for a lot longer than I have been, some trees. And I just wonder what they've experienced and what history they have, and if they communicate with each other. I think they absolutely do. There's actually a fungi that lives within the roots of trees that helps communication happen. I think it's called, I can't remember, whatever. But they absolutely do communicate through chemical signals and shifts in their energy, and I think that that's so beautiful, and I love it. And it just makes me curious about the trees that I've seen in my lifetime and the trees that have seen me, and how my presence affects them. Because when I don't know about you, but when I walk into the woods, there is a sense of calm that comes over me, which is why I love hiking so much. It's just like I'm unloading a lot of energy that I don't need. And I wonder if trees also feel that exchange. Yeah, I've wondered that for a long time, and I wonder if they could speak, what they would be saying. But to bring it back around to my original statement about the help signals going out, it's wild. And I think plants are just so intelligent, and they're proving that they are. It's just in a different way, and arguably probably a way that we could learn from, because as our environment changes due to the things that we're doing, maybe not intentionally, but unintentionally, and we're all learning as we go, we could take notes from the plants. I'm just saying. And I think that's why all of this research happens, is because if we can learn something from the plants that helps us evolve in a certain way to better humanity or to better the human experience, then why wouldn't we do that? I think it's a beautiful opportunity to learn from plants, and I don't think that we should write them off. And Zoë Schlanger actually ends this book with a concept, or going over some events where plants needed to be represented in court because of certain environmental changes that were going to happen to certain areas of the planet. I think there were rice fields somewhere in the US that a pipeline was going to go through, and the local community was like, this is absolutely unacceptable, first of all. But then someone stood up and represented the plants and the rice that was there, and I know it sounds a little silly, but if they cannot speak up for themselves, then someone needs to. There needs to be an advocate for the plants, because a big environmental shift caused by us feels a little disrespectful. Possibly there's something that I'm missing, some concept that I haven't thought of that would validate something like that, but I can't think of it right now. And I do believe that because plants can't speak up for themselves with a voice, that they should be advocated for to some degree, or at least considered. Spend a few more months, years coming up with a concept that doesn't disturb the environment so much. And I understand that takes time and that takes money, but maybe that time and that money will be invested a little bit better. Anyway, those are just my raw thoughts on the idea of a lawyer representing a plant. I love it because I think it makes sense. And I think we should be thinking about the way that these things are affecting the environment. Crazy, I know. Zoë Schlanger goes over additional concepts that I love, such as plants being able to recognize their own kin. Some can recognize that their leaves or their being are covering their siblings because of the light that goes through its own leaf. It bounces off the top of the leaf of the plant it's blocking and goes up back into the bottom of the original plant's leaves. And for some reason, that exchange of light signals to the plant that it is in fact covering its sibling, and then the plant will make a decision to change where it's growing so that its sibling is not covered, which is crazy. But some plants do the opposite, where, not to their siblings, but they will cover other plants. It's a apparently dog-eat-dog world out there, where if they are covering another plant that isn't part of their family, they'll continue to do so, and they do not care. It's just the information passed to the underside of the blocking plant is enough for it to determine whether it should move its leaves to help the plant it's blocking. That is intelligence. Plants may not have brains per se, but that takes consideration, that takes care, and I understand it. The goal is survival, so why wouldn't the plant do that almost? But it blows my brain way open. And I just think that if we applied that to the people in our community, to the people in our lives, the world might be a little kinder. And I think that a lot of people do that. I don't want to say that the world is this big ugly place where nothing good ever happens. I think that our brains very easily latch onto negativity, and then because of the environment that's created right now, it's just so easy for us to get stuck in that spiral. But I like to think and believe that for every negative thing that I hear, there's at least 5 to 10 positive things that have happened. It's just right now we're in this tornado, it feels like, of negativity in the grand scheme of things. And that's why community and connecting with other people is so valuable. And moving your leaf in order for your sibling or your community to access the sun is so important. And that's my metaphor for this episode. There you go. Yeah, that plant considering its kin and actually moving where it's growing so that its sibling can have access to more nutrients melted my heart, because I understand that it's for survival. I understand that there's a goal there and it's aggressive, but the original plant could just be like, fuck that guy, you know? Like, sometimes it is like that. Sometimes you gotta go, fuck that guy. But the idea that it recognizes that it's related to this plant below it, and then it moves its little leaf over so that it can have more sunshine. It's just so tender, and that can just be applied, that logic can be applied to so many things, and I think that that would create so much space for love and kindness, and I think that that is so important now and forever. Zoë Schlanger talks about the concept that plants evolve radically to their environment and actually become their environment. She, in the last few pages of her book, which is fucking wild, she talks about how plants may believe that there is no distinguished border between them and the environment around them. So if we apply that to human logic, if our bodies and our energy are part of the environment, so much so that we believe our actions and energy affect the environment that we're in, it's such a powerful concept. And the idea that plants evolve to their environment, because like I said earlier, they can't just get up and leave. They can't pack their bags. Oh, cute little plant bags. So they have to radically evolve to the environment around them and accept that it is, in some ways, part of their being. And Zoë Schlanger ends this book with this concept, and I think it is such a great way to end a book, and I think that she just did a great job of gathering her information and relaying it in a way that feels human. I know that we're not supposed to be comparing plant consciousness to human consciousness, but there are things that I think overlap, and they're quite beautiful things. And I do like the idea of us being part of the environment around us. It makes me really consider the way that I move through the world and the way that I interact with the environment around me. Not to dim the way that I move through the environment or anything like that, but to really hone in on my actions and my words and the way that those ripple throughout an environment. Even if the environment is somewhere that I never intend to be again, I want to leave a mark that is something that I would be proud of. And I think if plants feel that way, then it brings this little bit of magic into life, I think, and really makes me feel intentional and expansive. And I love that she ends the book that way. She just drops this bomb and she's like, okay, see ya. And in that same chapter, she talks about the plants being part of their environment and there not being anything to distinguish them from their environment, meaning everything is everyone. She has this lovely quote that she states that every inward breath of hers was first breathed out by plants. And that to me is so beautiful and makes me want to care for the plants and the planet and the environment even more than I already do, because we can't survive without plants. We need their oxygen, and the oxygen is created by them surviving and thriving and being happy. And so it's this very beautiful partnership that I think has been doing really well for so long. And I understand that the environment does need help right now. We do need to take into consideration the way that the plants are treated and cared for. I think that that's the majority of the general public's perspective, or at least the communities that are around me, because we can't breathe without them. We can't live without them. And we live in the environment, so that's why we should care for it. So Zoë Schlanger does a really, really, really nice job of doing this research, highlighting these studies. interviewing botanists, professors, etc., and gathering all these ideas and these concepts and these theories and building out a book that is impactful. And she does it in a tender way, and she does it in a human way. And some of these concepts cannot be proven yet, but it's fun to bring a little bit of magic into it, and it ticks something in my brain. And if any of this resonated with you, I highly, highly recommend that you check out The Light Eaters by Zoë Schlanger. It's about 170 pages, I think, and it's easy to consume, but it took me a while because every time I opened the book, it's just like a huge bomb drop on my concept of plants. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Chapter 1. This book is really, really fun, and I highly recommend it, as I do with any media that we cover here. Go check out Zoë Schlanger's The Light Eaters, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.